So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. This week's show is about SunPower. Unfortunately, they declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy last week. Now, I have a lot of respect for many of the things that SunPower did over the past 20 years. So rather than dance on their grave, this show is going to highlight some of their accomplishments that I witnessed firsthand over the past 15 years or so. I understand why some people are piling on about SunPower. Yes, I butted heads with them competitively over 15 years. They have that annoying over-the-top marketing. In my humble opinion, wasn't always true. But they had deep pockets, and they were able to outspend competitors. But they had the highest efficiency panels that only SunPower dealers could get. Bottom line, SunPower had really good products, a really good team in a fast-growing market. Everyone in the solar industry owes SunPower and their employees a debt of thanks. The reality is the world's solar industry would be much smaller without SunPower's early and determined leadership. Now, I'm just going to go through some of the highlights of the milestones that I remember, the contributions that they made to our industry over the past almost 20 years. As I mentioned, they had the highest efficiency solar panels. Dick Swanson had the brainstorm of putting all the contacts on the back. So this back contact brainstorm minimized the reflections from the wires on front of the cell so they could have a higher efficiency. SunPower managed to leverage that patent and related patents and stay ahead of the industry for many, many years. They were one of the very first solar companies to go public. They built a strong national dealer network, and my company, Akina Solar, was one of the very first SunPower dealers. SunPower did a really smart thing. They bought a C&I company called PowerLight that also had a proprietary product. PowerLight was dominant in the commercial and industrial market, C&I, and then they became dominant in the utility scale market. The PowerLight team was really strong addition to SunPower's management, as well as really push their sales number even higher and higher. They then transitioned a lot of the PowerLight team to become the largest global utility scale installer, EPC. Almost all of the record-sized PV systems were built by the PowerLight team in the aughts and the early teens, all over the world. You know, that was really building those markets. But what really impressed me here in the U.S., particularly in California, is SunPower was an early and strong supporter of the California Solar Energy Industries Association, which became the California Solar and Storage Association, SEIA, other state SEIAs, and also National Solar Energy Industry Association. They provided dedicated support to what we call Big Tent Solar, pushing ahead residential, C&I, and utility scale kind of all at once. Now, that big tent folded, in the teens as different markets really focus on their own segments. But without the SunPower team, there would have been much less money, much less enthusiasm, much less lobbying horsepower for solar in the U.S. So specifically, as part of the rest of the people at SEIA, at CALSSA, and specifically SunPower's team, along with the other team at CALSSA, lobbied really hard for something called the California Solar Initiative, the CSI program, in 2004 and 2005. I was very involved with it at the time too, and SunPower just brought a tremendous amount of enthusiasm, staffing, and horsepower to that effort. We all worked together with legislators and Governor Schwarzenegger, who was a tremendous solar enthusiast. The California Solar Initiative passed, added over $2 billion of funding for solar incentives in California, and that resulted in building over 1 million solar roofs. That's why California was the biggest market, and it's still the biggest market. But without that growth, without the cost effectiveness that came from installing so much solar, manufacturing so much solar, the market in California would have been much smaller. Now, another thing that happened in the 2006 to 2008 timeframe is SunPower and everybody else at CALSSA, SEIA lobbied really heavily for the extension of the investment tax credit. You got to think back almost 20 years ago. There was a small tax credit for solar, the investment tax credit, but it had a $2,000 cap for residential. Commercial was uncapped. Utility scale, uncapped. But for a homeowner, if you were putting in a $30,000 system, you only got a $6,000 tax credit instead of what you could have gotten, which would have been a 30% $9,000 tax credit. The uncapping of the ITC, in my view, was the biggest residential incentive in the U.S. because it applies everywhere. It's also very proportional, and it still is. So the team at SunPower worked with legislators and other companies like mine, worked with legislators and the Bush administration to manage to get that tax credit uncapped. And here's a little bit of trivia. That tax credit got uncapped in a horse trade, quid pro quo, with the Bush administration, the oil and gas industry, because the oil and gas industry wanted to open the world markets for exporting refined fossil fuels, for exporting diesel, gasoline, kerosene, things like that. And so there was that horse trade that happened. So the ITC got uncapped for residential, and the oil and gas industry got to export as much as they want as far as refined fuels. Yeah, it was a little bit of a Pyrrhic victory for hardcore environmentalists, but it definitely helped solar. And now the U.S. is exporting a ton of refined fuel and making a lot of money on it. And ironically, the price of gasoline in California in the U.S. is trading basically at the world price, which is a result of this change. But the residential solar industry really boomed when the investment tax credit was uncapped. And I'm just thinking about many of the far-sighted solar leaders at SunPower. Dick Swanson, the founder, president, Tom Werner, CEO for many, many years, Dan Shugar, Howard Wenger, people from the PowerLight team, Julie Blunden, Time Stars. The list goes on. These are people that I worked very closely with 10, 20 years ago. And SunPower became the training ground for many successful companies. I mean, two immediately come to mind. NexTracker is the biggest solar tracker company probably in the world. And then I'm just thinking more locally here in California, Renova is a very big and successful, one of the dominant installers in Arizona and California, mostly in the desert area. They've been doing really, really well. They've been hit a little bit with this bankruptcy of SunPower, but I'm sure Vince Battaglia over there, terrific operator, terrific leader. I'm sure he's going to figure that out and continue his company's growth even without SunPower. SunPower had some really big partnerships with inverter companies. They partnered with SMA to make a special inverter that worked with SunPower's positive ground solar panels. They then partnered with Enphase when SunPower figured out how to make regular negative ground solar panels. And I'd say to a large degree, SunPower's deal with Enphase effectively bailed Enphase out of a very, very challenging time they had. Enphase stock was really low. And when SunPower standardized on using AC panels using Enphase microinverters and their support, that really big order really, really helped Enphase and kicked them in the butt. And I have to say, the AC panels, really good idea, if I must say so myself, based on our original on-delay AC solar panels that we developed with Enphase back in 2008 and 2009. SunPower also had really good partnerships with large home builders like Lennar and some of the others. So they were doing whole developments of new homes all over the country, standardizing on SunPower panels. But then things began to change in the early 2010s. There were a variety of outside circumstances and some management missteps that led to SunPower's downfall. First, they sold off their utility scale business, and maybe it was too competitive and low margin or scaling too much internationally. They then closed down their C&I business, their commercial and industrial business. So those two businesses, I don't know what the profitability was, but they were driving a lot of top-line growth. But to a large degree, from a strategic technology sense, it made rational sense because SunPower has really high efficiency panels, which were ideal for constrained rooftops like residential. But for commercial, industrial, and especially for utility scale, it wasn't worth paying top dollar for the most efficient solar panels. Those markets, commercial, industrial, and utility, they demanded the lowest cost per watt panels. And so SunPower panels were the highest cost per watt. So what SunPower did, it was kind of ironically, when they're doing these commercial scale, utility scale installations, they were using other companies' panels. They had OEMs manufacture these white label panels. But what happened is SunPower lost that top line revenue growth from utility scale and C&I installations. But the biggest change, and I think the thing that affected SunPower the most, was when they lost their technological lead. They had the highest efficiency panels really going back to 2004 when they came to the market. But by the middle of the last decade, the middle of the teens, other companies had high efficiency panels too. We started using LG panels. They weren't quite as efficient as SunPower, but really close. And they also had a really good brand. So SunPower for the first time had some really good branded competition for high efficiency panels. And that's what we used, and we successfully competed against SunPower. Now, SunPower came out with AC panels. Ironically, LG did also. But SunPower's AC panels, and they were negative ground, so they worked fine. They did really well. They were built in with N-phase microinverters, and I love those panels because it was so easy to install. You didn't have to worry about unboxing an optimizer, unboxing a microinverter. It was all built into the back of the panel. But by 2020, SunPower, for whatever reason, maybe they kind of realized that Maxeon wasn't as big a contributor to the bottom line because it didn't have the clearest advantage in terms of technology. They spun out Maxeon. So I'm sure SunPower made some money on it. I think they kept a little bit of a minority stake. But after they spun out Maxeon, I kind of took a look at SunPower. I said, gee, they've lost a lot of their competitive advantages. They didn't make the highest efficiency panels anymore. They didn't make their own inverters. They were private labeled N-phase inverters. To a very large degree, they didn't do their own installations. They were working through a dealer network. Now, that does help, but when dealers can get a comparable product for about the same price or less, it's kind of questionable because then those dealers would have a high price. And SunPower never really had a competitive, high-performance, reliable battery system. All they had left was a really strong brand that they had built over a 15-year period. So, in my humble opinion, there were two external factors, two final nails in the coffin for SunPower. The first was the end of net metering in California in 2023. California is the biggest market. And the second was when interest rates spiked, that made financing for residential and all installations much, much more expensive. So both of these factors, the end of net metering and the high interest rates, really reduced customer economics. Customers were going from 6 or 7 year payback to 10-year payback. And the financing, maybe they weren't able to easily get to a cash flow positive deal with financing. And that led to a sales decline at SunPower. And as a company grows, or when you're growing quickly and you suddenly look at this big sales decline, it's very, very difficult to recover from that change in business trajectory. Now, kind of going forward, I'm sure SunPower's brand will continue as part of the Chapter 11 reorganization. I believe that the organization that's buying SunPower is going to keep the brand, and it's got a lot of value. There's lots of great people still at SunPower, including TJ Rogers, who's at the top. And I'm just kind of curious. I'm watching this. I'm curious to see how the reorganized SunPower, which is going to be SunPower plus a few other companies that are being combined into SunPower, is really going to take advantage of the undeniable future growth in solar and battery industry in the U.S. So kind of taking a step back, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from the rise and particularly the fall of SunPower? There are major industry headwinds affecting pretty much every residential and commercial company in the country. Not the utility scale companies because they're getting pushes from utilities. But that's because the biggest competition is coming from utilities. So any company that's really selling residential or commercial behind the meter solar, if you're in California, you're seeing how brutal that competition is in many, many ways. But that kind of competition is spreading to other utilities all around the country. And just kind of specifically utilities in California single-handedly ended net metering in California, which was by far and away the simplest and most effective incentive for people to buy solar. Even though electricity rates keep going up, it would be so much easier to sell solar with net metering. Utilities, by the way, they're doing the same thing. So don't think that this is just a California situation. That what happens in California has a tendency to spread, and utilities are using the exact same playbook that California utilities used all over the country to restrict behind-the-meter rooftop solar and storage. So, if you're a solar company, what you can do about that is there's a lot you can do independently, but the most important thing you can do is support your state solar organizations, such as the California Solar and Storage Association, and think about supporting SEIA and make sure that support of SEIA is going to trickle down into where you're working at the time. As Warren Zevon said, send lawyers guns and money. Now, I say leave the guns, just take the lawyers and the money as much as we can, and also the cannoli. So the second big lesson for solar companies, beware of very fast growth. especially in diverse markets. Now, solar markets vary a tremendous amount state by state. I used to run a Kena solar business in 7 different states. It was really hard to keep up with all the changes. And what was really hard for us is we would grow in a market, we would hire people, we would lease office space, get trucks, incentives would change, we'd have to let all that go, and then maybe 2 years later we would come back. Really expensive to do that. And the factor that really changed things was the incentives would change in the states, and the utility policies would change in the states. So it makes running a sustainable business very challenging. Happily, for whatever reason, I'm here in California, and it's still really hard just to run a business in California with all the pressure we're getting from utilities. The second thing to keep in mind is solar's easier to sell than to install. Aggressive and unethical salespeople can really give a company a bad name. It's really easy for them to sell, but if they sell incorrectly, if they overstate the benefits, if there's problems with the installation, that really can kill a company's reputation and give rooftop solar a bad name. And that's happening all over the country. There's a lot of companies that really focused on ruthless sales tactics. I'd hate to say it, but they would lie through their teeth, exaggerate the savings, minimize the cost, get people to sign binding contracts, and screw them. They are giving rooftop solar a really bad name. And I think what's going to end up happening is, just as when you buy a car, there's a tremendous amount of paperwork you have to go through, and actually different people. And the same thing when you buy a house, making a big investment in a house. It could be an inch or two thick of paperwork you need. I hope that doesn't happen with solar, but it will if we continue some of these sleazy sales processes. And finally, make no mistake, the utilities are indeed out to go after every residential and commercial solar company that installs solar behind the meter, every rooftop solar and storage company. They're the biggest long-term threat. We're watching what they're doing in California. It's not just clobbering net metering, but there's a half a dozen other things that the utilities have done by changing government policies that really are destructive to the success of inexpensive, reliable electricity. And we as an industry need to fight back very hard against that utility threat. Okay, that's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. Congratulations over the years to SunPower for being such a leader. And good luck to the companies, people, and customers who were affected, unfortunately, by SunPower's bankruptcy. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you miss any of today's show, you can always go to the Energy Show website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.